few weeks and months. One is a very positive storyline of a synchronized global recovery of an economy that's really doing quite well, certainly in the short term, perhaps in the medium term, but there are also major challenges on the horizon. You've gotten a lot of publicity for the debt report that you all have put out. That's an issue of growing concern in the US and many other economies. And there are large-scale political issues, which certainly play into and play off of the economic challenges. There are big structural changes, the move from a tangible to an intangible economy, the disruption that that's causing in labor markets, the ways in which that might require different regulatory frameworks, the challenges to really take the low-hanging fruit of productivity. So just a few small topics like that we're going to discuss here with David today. And we're gonna chat for about 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. So David, let me start by actually asking you to pull back and kind of set some of the things that I just put here in a framework, short-term, medium-term, long-term, kind of where are we and what are the challenges?
I'll do that. First, let me say welcome to everybody. It's good to have you all here. There are a couple more seats in the front, so come on in. And Rana, thank you so much for agreeing to do this today. I think it's hard to talk about the new challenges to the global economy looking very far forward without starting with the situation today and the baseline for the future. And our assessment, of course, is that we're in a cyclical recovery. It's a good recovery, but with GDP growing in excess of potential in advanced economies and in many places, it's clear that growth will have to slow. And we also know that there's been a downtrend in potential growth in a lot of places. So the real question is, what does it look like over the crest of the hill of this cycle? How strong and how long will this expansion be? And what's the other side going to look like? You know, for us, we see a medium term right now in the baseline that's for somewhat weaker growth because potential is slowing down. And that as well, while emerging market countries' growth is substantially higher than advanced economy countries' growth, and so many emerging market countries will be catching up over the medium term because they're growing faster than advanced economies. There's really an awful lot of countries who, on a per capita basis, right now, it looks to us, will not be catching up, where their per capita growth will actually be lower than in advanced economies. And that's, of course, not what should be happening. There should be, with interconnectedness and the transfer of technology and the accumulation of capital, there should be a process of catching up. It's not just true of small developing countries. Some of the I think it's 5 of the G20 emerging market countries out of 9, Russia, South Africa, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, their projected per capita growth is just about the same as in advanced economies. And so they don't have the prospect, we think, right now to be catching up. So the question is, if you see this medium term likely looking that way, you know, what are the questions about whether that baseline will really be realized, whether it can be improved? Now there are traditional issues and non-traditional issues, and you've heard a lot about the traditional issues, so I won't speak about them at length today. But we've said fix the roof while the sun is shining, make sure you have good macro policies so you don't stumble further and have a crises or stresses about your public finances. And we've said you should take structural reform measures and build infrastructure to try to improve potential growth. And we've warned about the sort of traditional risks that this recovery, because it is being supported by accommodative monetary policy, inherently means that there's low interest rates, liquidity, and credit creation. And you mentioned rising debt, which is good for propelling recovery, but it means vulnerabilities after the cycle turns. So there are all those, in essence, traditional issues. But I think today I'd like to focus a bit more on what I would call non-traditional or semi-traditional issues: trade, technology, and trust. Trade is non-traditional only in the sense that we've had a pretty long time since we've seen the kind of trade conflicts that we see. So it's an old issue come back. But I think that and technology and trust, each one of them has the potential to change the trajectory. And so I think the challenges that I think are worth focusing on beyond the sort of standard policy instruments is to think about how those three things will affect the future.
Okay, well, that's a great pivot point. Trade, technology, and trust. When you said those three words, I thought about a juxtaposition I think about a lot, which is that in many developed economies, unemployment rates are pretty low. You know, at the same time, you've got populist candidates rising in many of those same places. You and I spoke last year about the interplay between politics and economics. We've been talking, many of us, for 10 years about what the fallout is from the financial crisis and the loss of institutional trust that came out of that. How do you see these two issues of politics, economics, and trust playing out?
Well, first, I think it's behind the or underneath the issues around trade. You know, we've been saying for some time, and I guess we haven't been entirely convincing, that globalization is creating dislocation, which is leading to discontent, which is leading to political changes. It also does affect the issue of trust. And that all of those who advocate for globalization need to take account of this. Now, that's not to suggest that there should be policies that somehow keep capitalism from functioning. We know that in capitalism there are winners, there's losers, relative prices change, businesses, sectors rise and fall. But rather that there needs to be a way to make sure that growth is inclusive, that people feel that they, if displaced, have further opportunity, and that globalization is fair. Now, in the United States, I think it's really important not to demonize what I'll call the populist impulse. People are upset, I think, with some reason. Whether people can distinguish that it's globalization or technology that's affecting them is complex. There's been a lot of labor-saving technological change. Some technology is embedded in trade, so it's actually hard to ferret out the differences and all of that. But I think we need to respect that people have suffered, and that is affecting their political views. The point, though, is that the important thing is to avoid that translating into political actions that undermine globalization by undermining the trade and payment system. So in the face of the Trump administration's approaches to using actions to try to pressure other countries to negotiate, our reaction, and I think an appropriate reaction, is a two-sided one. It says that for those who, it's obviously China has, its success comes from globalization, from interconnectedness. Other countries that wish to advance rapidly, their future depends on the continuation of this. Many of those countries have entered into the WTO with rules that were appropriate to their country and country circumstances. But as countries mature, things that weren't consequential globally, when China was a small country, for example, are consequential globally when they're a very large country with such large GDP and with so many interactions in the global economy. So those who advocate for globalization and whose future depends upon it should take another look at their own practices, the things that are giving rise to the sense that now trade is not fair, and be willing to make changes. And I think we all need to consider whether the rules that have existed, WTO and otherwise, need to be rethought. But at the same time, we have to say to the Trump administration or others who might want to use unilateral trade policies, that doesn't, that's, I mean, history shows that doesn't, is not productive, doesn't end well, and that no one wins from a trade war. So I think this is one example, and perhaps the most salient one, and the one people will want to be talking about here in the meetings, where the, in a sense, the political and social ramifications of globalization are leading to a re-examination, but where it really matters how this is taken up.
Let me push a little bit on what you're saying and connect it to the part about technology. Even if we are to avoid, fingers crossed, some kind of a serious trade war, there does seem to be a way in which the U.S., Europe, China, perhaps taking away that some of the emerging markets are going different directions in terms of the digital economy, in terms of regulation around data markets, in terms of thinking about what the new rules of the road are. So if we say most value is living in IP, we are in the process, however long that might be, of shifting from a tangible to an intangible economy. Are we really at a pivot point where globalization as we know it is over and we are entering some kind of new era? And if so, what is that era?
I have no idea.
I like that. That means you're right.
But I think that the uncertainty around what all of these new technologies will produce for us is very large. And so, for example, when I say we have recommendations for countries to fix your macro and do structural change, we think we know how that will affect their growth trajectory. I suspect that the possible impact of new technologies on people's growth trajectory could be much, much greater. And so it really matters whether these technologies pan out. And they are bound to have both some positive effects and some create some dislocations. Like the example of trade, the adoption of technologies can be either good or bad. It's a matter of how they're used. If you think about it, automation will make some people rich, but it'll put some people out of work. That's a dislocation. E-commerce is a challenge to non-e-commerce. Fintech, not only if it's as it's being adopted in many places, may either happen in banks or in non-bank institutions and challenge incumbent banking institutions. It may create supervisory challenges which are already arising, say, in China, where Alibaba and Alipay are becoming like banks. So that there are a range of positives that can come out of technology. There are a range of negatives. And the real challenge for everyone is to try to enable new technologies and allow experimentation and allow creative destruction and give everything time, but also to choose the right balance between that and dealing with the consequences. I fear that policymakers being eager to act and being responsive to populations may over-regulate, may overly constrain technologies. And now let me give you the example that says, you mentioned intangible capital. Much of this is intangible, and what it will take to figure out what's the best way to monetize, make a business proposition around new technology is a tricky business. Let me give you the example of Thomas Edison. He invented the light bulb in around 1880, and he actually tried to monetize it and didn't really have the best model. He wanted to generate electricity and power in a particular place. What he didn't realize was that the real efficiencies would come from turning electricity into a utility where there was power generation that powered a whole city, powered many entities at the same time. 20 years after Edison, only 5% of U.S. companies were using electricity for their power. They were still using water and steam and horses. 30 years after the light bulb was invented, only 40% of electricity in the United States was produced in utilities and distributed, in taking advantage of the costs. And that was because it required inventing alternating current, inventing certain kinds of steam turbines, convincing people to give up all kinds of equipment that they had in place that did stuff the old way. 40 years after Edison, 70% of electricity in the United States was generated by utilities. There's an analog here. Used to be that every college and every business had a mainframe computer. Now computing is much more like a utility. So we've seen that transition happening there. But in the new technologies, we just don't know yet what will be the profitable uses. And so it's very important that entrepreneurs are given enough run to try to make something of this. But what we see is people concerned about displacement of work, creative destruction that will put firms out of business, changes in the monetary transmission mechanism if credit is being given by e-commerce companies, concerns about privacy, the really, really big new issue about vulnerability to cyber attack, the operational risk if these big networks are carrying out most of the payments of your financial system, and of course now the question of antitrust. How big should these companies be and what is their market power? So, there are legitimate policy questions, and getting this right is tricky. It's a long way to get to. I want to come back to your question, which is, I suspect different countries will see the technologies advance at different speeds. They'll have different tolerance for creative destruction. They'll make different choices about regulatory responses. For example, some companies, Alibaba, Alipay, will expand rapidly in Asia, but they won't be welcomed in the United States and Europe. And with different, Europe is taking a very hard line, perhaps appropriately, but a very hard line in competition policy and thinking about the big U.S. companies. There is a risk of fragmentation. There is a risk of different approaches to the policy side. And I think that's something the IMF will be thinking about for a long time.
Are you worried about that kind of regionalism impacting growth in the next 3 to 5 years, let's say?
No, not so much. I think in the next 3 to 5 years, the challenge will be to think through what's the agenda for thinking about this. Can we agree on some common approaches? Can we, many central banks have created what they call sandboxes to allow certain financial technologies to be, tried out and in a way that allows experimentation and learning, but minimizes or contains risk. I think we'll be in the discussion phase. I suspect it won't be until, well, maybe things will move really, really, really rapidly. Jack Ma has quipped that in this technological age, if you're 3 years behind, you're a century behind. So it may be, and some of the fintech is moving extremely quickly and spreading very quickly in Asia. So it may be that some of these issues become more difficult and consequential quickly. We'll have to see.
One of the big complaints about globalization, for a number of decades, but particularly in the last 10 years, has been that it's favored capital over labor. Is it possible that the transition to a digital economy and the fact that you're now dealing with data that can move across borders, a perimeterless world really, at a time when in the real world there are walls, sometimes literal, going up. Is that something that could maybe put the problems of globalization on steroids?
Yeah, I think that your question edges into the question of what's going on with trust in the world. And, I think of trust, I think trust is eroding in many places, not everywhere, and not in every way. But surveys say that there's an erosion of trust in institutions in many places. And if you ask what are the sources, I think it comes partly from globalization. We've talked about that and why. It comes from the global financial crisis and the European financial crisis, where people felt as though their elected governments didn't stop it from happening and then didn't fix it very quickly. and then there was no accountability for people who perhaps were responsible. And then from technology, and we see all the time that, I mean, technology on the one hand is changing the way in which people interact. You know, rather than having national constituencies for issues, you have local, and you have social media constituencies. You know, we see this erosion of trust at the center. Governments, political parties. Used to be that a political party was the way in which the set of interests of part of the population are expressed in order to try to get political action. But now you see people trusting what they can control, trusting closer to home, trusting local authorities, trusting civil society organizations and NGOs, trusting movements, single issue movements. So I think we're seeing a decentralization of trust, and to some extent that's enabled by the technology. I think the loss of trust is also coming from the technology. The fact that there's fake news. The fact that, I mean, now in a sense, the population is turning on the creator with Facebook failing to satisfy people that their own private information will stay private. So I think both at the national level, the regional level, meaning take a look at Europe and the loss of trust in Brussels and the preference for institutions closer to home, easier to control. And then at the at the global level, in all of what we've talked about with trade, I think trust is decentralizing. And the reason it's important is the main point. The reason that it's important is that the more and more trust becomes local, the less and less you have leaders, the trusted leaders being local, who have the power to make decisions and take actions that require central authority, whether it's national authority or everything that's going on here this week, international cooperation. And I think that's going to be the central conundrum of governance in a world where trust is decentralizing. I think it means that, you know, I started out by talking about traditional policy instruments. I think in this world of decentralizing trust, old instruments won't work the way they used to. And they
old instruments meaning?
Well, I mean, you know, basically any policy that you take, say a trade liberalization that under the Doha round or the previous rounds would have been taken as a great success, well now, you know, it may engender more distrust, and you have to think about that. I mean, we can go through different policy instruments, and I think almost all of them now have to be examined from a perspective of whether it's stabilization, liberalization, or growth structural-oriented policies. Each one of them will have to be examined not only in terms of its intended effect, but what are the byproducts, how does it affect cohesion, trust, and ultimately sustainability of the policy.
So really interesting. We're jumping around a little bit, but it's all connected. I mean, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about how do you negotiate trade deals in a world in which 3D printing changes up national origin laws. I mean, you know, I could come up with 10 more examples. Are we going to see a major recalibration, rewriting of the global rules of the road in the next few years?
I don't know. I mean, probably yes. I think some of that is called for because unless the rules are viewed as generating a fair result, globalization just won't be sustainable. But I think some of the new issues, you know, we talked about the big tech companies. It was one thing in the 19th century to decide that there was a need for antitrust policy with respect to the railroads or Standard Oil. That was essentially a national decision. These companies, however, are operating everywhere, including in the cloud. And unless there can be some, and antitrust has always been, I mean, apart from the European competition policy, which is regional, it's essentially a national policy. So unless the world can figure out how to come up with a common approach, we have a bit of a problem. Already, this is manifesting itself in that some countries want to tax these companies and some want to regulate these companies. I suspect some will want to break up these companies. Those are the sort of the three most sort of go-to policies. I'm not sure what the right approach is. It's not really an expertise here, but I think we're all going to have to think about it and learn a bit about it. But it's an example of what you're saying, that there'll have to be a development of new approaches. More will have to be harmonized, and it will have to be done at a time when national and regional leadership is perhaps weaker than it was.
So all these policies shift in antitrust, maybe thinking about some broader definition that isn't just about consumer welfare, new methods of taxation in which you might be looking at local revenue on the ground, taxing something that can't move. All these things are touching on the issue of the labor capital divide and of inequality, which is something, actually, when we were fielding questions on Twitter, that's something that came up quite a lot that people wanted to talk about. Yeah. What are the opportunities? I mean, from what you've sketched and what we've all read, it really seems we're at a pivot point here where you can imagine a world in which network effects, the rise of monopoly power, 80% of corporate value living in 10% of IP-rich companies, could take us in a direction that is very bad and creates a snowball effect of all the problems that you've talked about. But you can also imagine a way in which the digital economy could empower small and mid-sized businesses, potentially allow even individuals to own and monetize their own data and IP in a different way. How do we make sure we take the right path there for inclusive growth?
I think you raised the right question. I think the answer is it will do both. Look, if there are very, very, very profitable companies and people getting rich, it can be because somebody came up with a great idea. Or it can be that somebody came up with an idea and figured out how to have market power and make, in a sense, economic rents. And sorting out which that is, and whichever it is, dealing with the inequality that may result, irrespective of which it is, maintaining a sense of fairness in the country is, if you're talking about a country, is a tricky business. This is not new. I mean, the populism in the 1900s turned to progressivism in the early 20th century in the United States, exactly around the Gilded Age, which had both of these things happening. Great ideas, monopoly power.
What shifted
then? And the point, though, is that worse than today, capital took advantage of labor. There were child labor abuses and other abuses. And so what we saw was when, in 1912, there were 4 candidates for president. 2 were Republicans. 1 was a Democrat. 1 was Eugene Debs. There were basically 3 progressives and 1 communist. There was no one running on behalf of business. Politics responded, and then Woodrow Wilson passed child labor law, women's suffrage, created the Fed, progressive income tax, forgetting one, but major legislation that tried to redress abuses. I don't think we have sorted out really what's okay and what's not okay. It's not clear what a legislative agenda may be, but it is important that populism turn to progressivism in that, I don't have a thing for the term, but in the sense of trying to find policies that will enable and encourage the great productive possibilities, but also limit the abuses, make sure that it's fair and that people have equal opportunity.
We've been talking about concentration of power, particularly concentration of corporate power. Large multinational corporations have more cash on the balance sheet than ever before. They also have record levels of debt. And that has, by some accounts, created some instability in the financial markets. It's certainly created a sense of concern amongst Main Street, and the divide between Wall Street and Main Street seems to be growing. Are you blinking yellow on this, red on this? How worried are you?
Well, we've been talking
politically and economically.
We've been talking this week about the number 164 trillion. 164 trillion is the total debt right now in the world, public and private. Just to give you a sense, that's more than twice global GDP. That's about it includes the public and the private. I think it's a real worry in some places and less so in others. And us being the IMF, we'll try to help our members sort it through appropriately country by country. But I would say that the problem is that if the next big economic downturn is somehow harsh and involves failures because of debt stress, it may well be that countries have much less room for maneuver in dealing with the problem. There are, because a lot of this is sovereign debt, it means that the leeway that governments have to borrow to have counter-cyclical policies is diminished. We know that monetary authorities in the major countries have lowered interest rates so low that, Larry Summers has pointed out that the average easing in past recessions has been in the neighborhood of 500 basis points. And right now, most central banks don't have 500 basis points of easing space. But beyond that, the other avenues for resolution of indebtedness, especially in rescuing banks, supporting markets that are failing in the way that the Fed did. Many of those avenues have been closed by legislation, both in the United States and Europe. And coming back to the trust issue, the political tolerance may be much less. TARP here, the law that provided $600 billion to deal with the problems of the banks, barely passed and would never pass again. The sense of unease with the active involvement of the Fed in the economy may mean that Congress really won't allow the Fed to have the kind of leeway to respond, whether it's domestic or in terms of, a central banker said to me today that the kind of international swaps that were given last time are politically just totally unimaginable now. So I want to be careful. I think the risk of a downturn leading to stresses in the banking system is much, much less. Financial and regulatory reform has made the banks much safer. That was the whole idea. But if something were to happen, and these debt problems can perhaps manifest themselves in other ways, if something were to happen, I think we have, from a policy from a policy perspective, in terms of legal room and in terms of popular support, we have much less room for maneuver.
What worries you?
That's worrisome.
Yeah, absolutely. What worries you more, the debt situation and the growing deficit concerns in the U.S. or China's debt run-up in the last decade?
I'm not allowed to be concerned about both?
Well, I have to ask the question.
Yeah. I guess I'm going to give you this. Actually, I'm worried about both in the same sense, in the sense that neither is a problem today or tomorrow, and both are problems that if they aren't addressed, they will eventually be really quite serious and possibly devastating. The United States has brought unemployment way down, and using pro-cyclical policy beyond a certain point will cause overheating, and following overheating, the necessity for Fed action. Fed action in a world where there are the kinds of debt vulnerabilities we talked about becomes a more dangerous mix. So getting the U.S. debt on a downward trajectory reasonably soon is a good idea. China, unlike, what I was saying about space, legal and political space, it was for the U.S. and Europe. China is in a different situation given its governmental system, but the numbers are quite big. The financial system has grown very substantially. The country's lending operations and borrowing is very decentralized, with a lot of local government and provincial government projects and financial vehicles supported by debt. China's trying to take the bull by the horns. Last year, the president of China proclaimed that financial stability is a national security issue, which will, in essence, previously there seemed to be no room to take policies that might lower the growth rate. Now they speak about quality growth, and they are undertaking efforts to rein in non-bank finance and willing to do so even if there is some sacrifice to growth. Hasn't happened, but I think they are showing their willingness. But at the same time, that number I said, the 164 trillion, has increased 40% since the global financial crisis began, and 40% of that increase is from China.
Before I move away from debt and potential points of market instability, is there anything else that you would call out or say is blinking red that you want to make a point about?
Not right now.
Okay. Let's go back to a point that you made earlier about productivity. The gains from the Industrial Revolution took a long time to play out. When we think about the move to a digital economy, we're kind of arguably at the end of the first stage, maybe of the consumer internet. We're now entering the Internet of Things. Hopefully, many more productivity gains to be had, but will they be bifurcated?
Yeah, I think it's hard to know. I will add, if we're going to talk about the medium term, I will add one thought for people to mull over. One thing we're seeing in the world is more and more restriction being placed on foreign direct investment by the target country on the grounds of national security. And it's happening in the U.S., but it's not just happening in the U.S., it happens in pretty much in both directions. And I worry that the Internet of Things may make that problem worse.
Oh, interesting.
Because if everything has computers and chips in them, what do you have to worry about? I was talking to a Chinese official and saying, why is it that so many of your foreign direct investment projects turn out to be right next door to a nuclear facility or, involve some high-tech thing? Why can't you make widgets in the United States and show, that you can be successful? After all, Europeans make cars in Alabama and South Carolina, and even the Koreans make cars in the United States. And he said, well, we have a glass factory in Ohio. But 10 years from now, maybe 2 years from now, if all the glass has chips in it that determine the temperature and the light, and they adjust the tint of the glass, you can just imagine people being concerned about the capabilities of those chips. And so, I worry that the risk of cyber attack, in this or cyber monitoring or whatever, when you think of it in the broadest sense, if that can't be dealt with, and everything is, part of this new technology and part of this information network, whether there can be a continuation of the interconnections that we across national borders that we presently enjoy.
Well, that's very interesting because you're already hearing some of the largest U.S. tech firms using the sort of nationalism card when the issue of regulation comes up.
Yeah, I mean, look, one has to distinguish that there are surely political and geopolitical aspects with, the U.S. having been a lead country and China being a rising power. There are rivalries. There are things done for many reasons. But I'm positing that there may be some, say, enduring and fundamental issues apart from the geopolitical questions that may come to be important.
Right. One way, of course, to make sure that growth is shared is to keep education ahead of technology.
Yeah.
That's a big issue at a time when there's more public debt than ever before, when governments are polarized, and yet every business I talk to in every single country is concerned about education. Number one issue, national security issue. How do you square that circle?
Well, we try very hard to speak about this and support countries emphasizing education. But I think we all have to admit that there is a lot we don't know. We don't know necessarily how to turn a certain amount of dollars into a certain amount of education. There are countries where more money doesn't mean better education. You know, we spend a lot of energy with countries trying to make sure that health, education, and infrastructure spending don't get squeezed out by, say, wasteful subsidies that subsidize people who could perfectly well afford the things being subsidized, and so on. But we have to acknowledge that we're not so, it's really not our expertise, and it's really not clear how to deliver quality education. And in the world you're talking about, what kind of education? I mean, you hear two different things that are completely in conflict. You hear we really have to emphasize STEM education. And then you hear from educators and even technology experts who think about automation and AI in a world where brawn is replaced by machines, and you have to ask what kinds of things will people do. They say, well, you really need a general set of skills, empathy, and the ability to solve problems, which means everyone should go to liberal arts college.
Right, right.
So
yeah, those are the jobs the robots can't do.
And I don't know what's right. Maybe maybe we will learn by doing, or learn that it's the smartest hedge is to do some of both, or that you have some people do some and some people do the other. But I think this whole subject of how education can best, there are some very simple things, which is that everyone should have the opportunity for education, especially in poorer countries, especially where girls don't, that there are huge returns to universal education and to educating girls. But once you get to a country that's spending a lot of money on education, asking how do you really get the most out of it, not yet clear.
Before I open it up, let me ask you one final question and kind of push that idea a little bit forward. You touched earlier on how the shift to a digital economy might have different kinds of disruptions in different parts of the world. Do you imagine that AI is going to have a more disruptive effect on labor markets, say in emerging economies, where they may then jump over that industrialization point that has been a wealth creator in the past?
Well, I think what we know so far is that automation, I mean, we're just really beginning with AI, and the dissemination of AI is not terribly broad yet, excuse me. But, there's been more labor-saving technical change, automation, in the high-income, rich countries so far. That's because the return to it was higher. But I do think what's happened in the U.S. and Europe is a preview of coming attractions, and for countries that have reached middle income, I think this could deepen the middle income trap. There are unanswered questions about whether AI eventually will be a substitute or a complement, whether everyone will have more AI and everyone will be a different kind of worker, but a more effective worker. But I think in the sort of short to medium term run, the risk is that countries that have hit middle income may find that both the jobs will move to poorer countries, but also people will be replaced by machines, and so they start to see the dislocations that the U.S. and Europe have seen, and that some of the discontent from dislocation will be an issue there, coming back to the earlier part of our conversation. Now, the other issue, of course, is the age-old issue that we saw first in the Industrial Revolution, which is that, when the machines were, when the Industrial Revolution, we saw mechanization and people lost jobs, the economy was vital enough that they found good jobs somewhere else. The new technology creates wealth both for the inventor and the workers who use the machines have higher wages and they spend money, and so in a general equilibrium sense, there's enough dynamism that other people are employed. And we don't know whether that's going to happen too. But we do see that what's really going on is people are going out of manufacturing and into services. So we at the fund have been studying, and our World Economic Outlook this year has a really nice, the one that just came out,
Yep.
has a really nice chapter that looks into the question, if people are leaving manufacturing, do they go to lower productivity or higher productivity jobs? And the answer is that services are multivaried, and that there are both low and medium and high productivity services. But there really are some quite high productivity service sectors. And so it may be, not that countries can choose to have all of one or another, but there may be ways, it's not necessarily the case, and policymakers shouldn't fight the exit from manufacturing of people if it's part of an increasing of the effectiveness of manufacturing on this reason alone, because rather they should be trying to build strong economies with strong and high productive service sectors. Take a look at our chapter.
Okay. With that, we've got about a little over 10 minutes. Let's open it up for some questions. And if you can just introduce yourself and make sure there is a question mark at the end of your question in the back.
Thank you. My name is Sai. I'm with BNP Paribas. You've talked about trade, trust, and the dispersion of technology, all of which tie into the trend of protectionism and populism. What are the implications of this for the willingness and ability of governments to act on issues that require global coordination, such as the environment or sustainable economic growth?
Yeah. That's an excellent question. When I said that the conundrum is that when there's local trust, those with power won't be able to deal with the problems that require centralized action. I had in mind global public goods. I think this will be a challenge. I don't know what the answer is, but surely it will involve establishing broader public support for these global public goods. I think that's happening on climate change. I hope it happens on some of the other important issues. But it doesn't, we see in the United States this interaction of social media, localized news that's tailored to particular audiences on social media, that's not really supportive of truthful and useful analysis of issues. We, from the standpoint of the IMF, will try to say sensible things on these important topics, and I think we are maintaining our credibility, and I hope that we can help convene discussions and bring people together to the right common positions.
Is there a question? Did I miss someone's hand over here? Oh my goodness. We've just covered major structural shifts in just about every country. You got to have a few more questions. Otherwise, I'm going to take back the mic. Here we go, in the front.
Yeah, this is Francesco Miucci from APCA Worldwide. You mentioned the accumulation of debt, and you mentioned that 40% of that new debt has been accumulated or is coming from China. So I wonder whether part of the new things that will have to be sorted out is when and if global growth stops. Do you feel we have sufficient mechanisms in place to sort of solve the problems between creditors and debtor countries? I'm thinking of the Paris Club, and I'm thinking whether that is something that you are worried about looking forward.
It is, as a general matter. I think you put your finger on another area where if there's not mutual trust and respect among countries, creditor coordination may break down. We've come upon a new problem, which is that there are countries, especially in Africa, that benefited from the debt operations in the over the 1990s and 2000s, the HIPC and MDRI initiatives, and that since then Paris Club creditors have been very cautious and have really only given grants or concessional loans in order to prevent a re-emergence of a debt difficulty, but for various reasons, and it's really a range of reasons. Some countries have had their commodity prices decline unexpectedly. Some countries have overspent or overconsumed. But for various reasons, there are countries that are now developing some debt difficulties, and the Paris Club creditors aren't the creditors. The creditors are new non-Paris Club creditors, some Middle East, China, others. And so our parochial issue is we want to help a country. We can only do so if their program is financed. Their program being financed may require debt operations. Debt operations requires creditor cooperation. And some of these are countries that just have never done this before. There are a lot of, I can tell you, there are a lot of complications in developing a new creditor, a new approach among these new creditors, and so that is an issue.
Okay, we have time for maybe one or two more questions up here.
Hilton Root, George Mason University. The World Bank has been trumpeting new products that they are turning out to deal with global risks, such as pandemics, such as famines. These are new financial instruments that entail a different type of cooperation with private sector investment. I just wonder if the IMF is also moving in the direction of new risk products for these kind of highly stressed situations.
We pioneered a new facility to try to deal with the pandemic in West Africa, and we were very quick to be able to provide funding there. In all of what we do, we have to stay in our model. The World Bank has a reasonably ample amount of concessional money, and we don't. So when we do something like what we did, we had to put together a pool, a modest-sized pool of money to do that. So there are some limits when the support is support that has to be given at very concessional terms. Both institutions have had since the get-go the constraint, the starting point that we lend to countries. And so dealing with something that is a public good or a public bad that needs to be addressed that crosses borders is trickier. And sometimes our support is rather of the form to help all the countries that are commonly facing some problem at the time that they are facing it. But I think, on pandemics, we have a facility we have used and can use where there are devastating earthquakes to get money very quickly. So there are some such cases where we've been able to be very much ahead of the curve.
Let me ask you a final question, David, before we end the session. We've talked a lot about the changing nature of growth. We've talked about AI. We've talked about what jobs the robots may or may not be taking, the fact that we're going to see a lot of labor market disruption. What about the meaning of work? What would you like to see countries thinking about on that front?
We had a meeting here with leading scientists and really some quite impressive folks about 2 weeks ago. And one of the things that they all seemed to agree upon was that whatever is happening in the macroeconomy, what's really most important for people is to have meaningful work and to be part of a community. And I think that's probably a pretty important insight. After the meeting, it occurred to me that it's really a rather fine line between saying the problem with the modern economy is that it's hard for people to find meaningful work, and saying that the problem with capitalism is the alienation of people from the means of production. But I think there are some truths, and I think it's well worth thinking about. I suspect that the automation, the AI, will lead people to, by replacing work that is essentially requires brawn, I think it'll probably create some more interesting work. And I also think that those who are displaced from more menial work may end up working in service sectors where, as I was suggesting before, empathy and social interaction may be important. The demographics of the advanced economies of aging, and the fact that the older people in our societies, and we did a report last year that showed that this is a real feature in Europe. Older people are among the wealthier people. There'll be a very strong demand for all kinds of care and support, not to mention technology-assisted support for older people. And so when you ask what's the new service sector going to look like, probably helping older people in one way or another in their post-retirement years will be a part of that. And I suspect that can be very meaningful work.
Well, David, it is always meaningful to work with you. Thank you so much for your comments, and thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, that was good.